Thebes, Egypt, the 9th day of the 3rd month of Akhet, 714 years before the birth of Christ. A princess moves through, corridors carved from limestone that has stood for 1,000 years. Her name is Shepenwepet, daughter of Pharaoh Asorkan III, and she is 14 years old. She wears white linen so fine it took 6 months to weave. Gold circles her wrists and throat. Her hair is dressed with oils that smell of myrrh and frankincense. By every visible measure, she is being prepared for the highest honor a royal daughter can receive. She is terrified. The corridors lead deeper into the temple of Karnak. They pass public halls where common people leave offerings, past courtyards where priests perform ceremonies for thousands to see. These are the spaces her father knows, the spaces that appear in official accounts, the spaces that represent Egyptian religion as divine order and sacred majesty. But she walks beyond those spaces now, through doorways only priests may pass, down passages that narrow with each turn, toward chambers that exist in no public record, toward rituals that will never be described in hieroglyphs meant for common eyes. 3 priestesses accompany her. They are not guards exactly. They do not restrain her. They simply walk beside her with the calm certainty of women who have performed this task before, women who have led other princesses down these same corridors, women who know precisely what awaits in the chamber ahead. One of them, the eldest, speaks. You understand the honor being bestowed upon you. You will become God's wife of Amun. You will speak for the divine. You will mediate between the earthly realm and the celestial. Your father's kingdom depends on your service. Shepenwepet understands the words. She has been taught their meaning over 6 months of preparation. But understanding and acceptance are not the same thing. She knows what the public ceremony will involve tomorrow. The pronouncements before the crowds. The ritual marriage to the god Amun performed in the main temple. The titles conferred, the honors proclaimed. What she does not know is what happens tonight, in these hidden chambers, during rituals that her father, the most powerful man in Egypt, has never witnessed and will never be told about in detail. The gap between public, ceremony, and private reality is where the true transformation occurs. And it is about that gap that no one has spoken honestly. Her father sits in his palace at this very moment, perhaps 50 paces away through stone walls that might as well be mountains. He believes his daughter is being prepared for the morning ceremony. He believes she is being instructed in her final prayers and purifications. He has been told that tonight's rituals are too sacred for even a pharaoh to witness, that the god requires privacy with his chosen consort during these final preparations. He believes this because refusing to believe would require an action he cannot take. The treaty with the Amun priesthood has been signed. The political arrangements are complete. Shepenwepet's dedication secures Egyptian stability in a time when foreign powers threaten from all directions. Her father has sacrificed his daughter to preserve his kingdom. Acknowledging what that sacrifice actually costs would destroy him. Better to believe the priests. Better to trust the religious authorities, who promise that honor and devotion await his child. Meanwhile, that child walks towards something her father cannot imagine and would not permit if he understood. The corridor ends at a door, not the gilded massive doors of the public temple. This door is plain limestone, indistinguishable from the wall except for a slight seam marking its outline. One priestess produces a key. The door swings inward with a sound that echoes off stone. The chamber beyond is small, perhaps 15 feet across, and circular. The walls are covered in hieroglyphs that Shepenwepet can read, but whose meanings in this context feel threatening rather than sacred. Instructions, procedures, the documentation of what has occurred in this space for centuries. At the center sits a stone basin, filled with a liquid that gleams dark in the lamplight. Not water, something else. The smell is bitter, medicinal, overlaid with incense smoke that coils through the chamber. 4 priests wait in the shadows. They wear the leopard skins that mark the highest ranks of the Amun priesthood. Their faces are painted, with ochre and kohl and patterns that transform them from men into representations of divine authority. They do not speak. They simply watch as Shepenwepet enters. The eldest priestess gestures toward the basin. The purification must be complete. Remove your garments and enter the sacred water. This is the moment when the public narrative and the hidden reality begin to diverge. Everything that follows occurs under the language of sacred ritual, divine service, and holy transformation. But the reality involves procedures that would horrify Shepenwepet's father if described in plain language. The genius of the system is that it never will be described in plain language. It will be recorded as religious ceremony. It will be remembered as the honored dedication of a princess to divine service. And Shepenwepet will never be able to tell anyone what actually happened in this chamber. not because she will be prevented from speaking, but because the system has developed techniques for ensuring that victims cannot articulate their own violation without simultaneously desecrating the sacred foundations of Egyptian society. But here is what makes this moment truly remarkable. What makes it worse than anything happening in public view? 3 chambers away, another woman sits alone. Her name is Amenirtis I, and she held the position of God's wife before the adoption system was implemented. She is 53 years old. She has lived in this temple complex for 38 years, and she knows exactly what is happening to Shepenwepet right now, because the same thing happened to her decades ago. She could walk to that chamber. She has the authority. She is still God's wife, soon to be replaced, but not yet dismissed. She could enter that room and stop what is about to occur. She sits in her quarters instead, hands clenched, breathing carefully controlled, while sounds that should not exist reach her through the stone walls. She learned over decades that intervention is impossible. The one time she tried to warn a younger woman, she was subjected to purification rituals that lasted 3 days and left her unable to walk for a week. She learned, she adapted, she survived by not interfering with the system's perpetuation. But tonight the sounds are louder than usual, or perhaps she is simply more aware, or perhaps after 38 years of numbness, something has cracked and she can feel again. Whatever the cause, she sits in luxury that mocks her powerlessness, and listens while another girl is destroyed in the name of divine service. Tonight, you will discover how the Amun priesthood constructed this system, how they rose to power that rivaled the pharaohs themselves, how they transformed religious authority into mechanisms of control over royal women, how they developed rituals that served political and personal exploitation while maintaining the appearance of divine service, how they built infrastructure within temples that created spaces beyond oversight, how they selected, isolated, and transformed the daughters of Egypt's rulers into instruments that served priestly power. You will discover what happened to women who tried to resist, what happened to the servants who witnessed and tried to help, what happened to family members who attempted intervention. You will learn about the economic systems that made this exploitation profitable, the legal frameworks that made it technically legitimate, the religious justifications that made it psychologically acceptable to thousands of participants. This is not speculation. This is not sensationalized fiction. This is documented history that Egyptologists have been piecing together from temple inscriptions, tomb records, administrative papyri, and archaeological evidence. The sources exist. The patterns are clear. The individual stories emerge from careful analysis of what the official records say, and more importantly, what they strategically omit. The god's wife of Amun was real. Shepenwepet was real. The other women who held this title were real. What happened to them was systematic, calculated, and hidden under layers of religious language that made honest discussion nearly impossible, even for their contemporaries. Before we continue, understand that what follows examines power, religion, and exploitation in ways that are deeply disturbing. These were not random acts of individual cruelty. This was institutional practice maintained across centuries. The horror lies in the systematic nature, in the administrative competence, in the way a sophisticated civilization constructed frameworks that transformed abuse into sacred duty. Stay until the end, because what you'll learn will completely shatter everything you thought you knew about ancient Egypt. If you're enjoying this journey, please like the video and subscribe to the channel to support a fellow history enthusiast. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. I'm always amazed by how far these stories reach. Now let us return to that chamber beneath Karnak and discover what happened when Shepenwepet stepped into that basin. But first, we must understand how this system came to exist in the first place, because the origins reveal intentions that later propaganda tried to obscure. To understand how Egyptian high priests gained the power to control the pharaoh's daughters, you must first grasp the unique nature of the Amun priesthood and how it evolved over 1,000 years into a state within a state. Egypt's religious system was never monolithic. The land contained thousands of temples dedicated to hundreds of deities. Each major city had its patron god. Each temple had its priesthood. For most of Egyptian history, pharaohs maintained clear supremacy over religious institutions. They appointed high priests. They controlled temple revenues. They ensured that no single priesthood accumulated enough power to challenge royal authority. But Amun was different from the beginning. The god originated in Thebes, a relatively minor city during the Old Kingdom. When Theban princes overthrew foreign rulers and established the Middle Kingdom around 2000 years before the Common Era, they elevated their local deity to national prominence. Amun became associated with the sun god Ra, merging into Amun-Ra, king of the gods. Thebes became the religious capital, and the priests who served Amun suddenly found themselves managing the most important cult in Egypt. The New Kingdom, beginning around 1550 BCE, brought explosive growth in Amun's prominence. Pharaohs campaigned across the Near East, conquering territories from Nubia to Syria. They attributed their military success to Amun's favor. They showered the Theban temples with tribute from conquered peoples. Gold, silver, land, slaves, the wealth flowing into Karnak Temple became staggering. Contemporary records provide specific numbers that reveal the scale. A papyrus from the reign of Ramesses III documents that the Amun temples owned 421,000 head of cattle, 433 gardens, over 80 ships, 65 villages, and employed 81,000 workers. This was not a religious institution in the modern sense. This was an economic empire. By the time of Ramesses III, around 1150 BCE, the Amun priesthood controlled nearly one-third of Egypt's arable land. They employed tens of thousands of people. They operated workshops, farms, mines, and trading expeditions. They maintained private armies for protecting their vast holdings. They had become, in economic and political terms, as powerful as the pharaoh himself. But here is what the official inscriptions never directly stated. This wealth created corruption that the priesthood itself, documented in internal records, never meant for public view. Administrative papyri discovered in temple archives reveal embezzlement, bribery, and the systematic exploitation of workers. Priests lived in luxury that exceeded royal standards, while temple laborers subsisted on minimal rations. The gap between religious ideals and actual practice was enormous. This created a fundamental problem. Pharaohs derived legitimacy from a divine mandate. They ruled because the gods approved. But if the priests who supposedly mediated divine will became too powerful and too corrupt, they could threaten that legitimacy. They could declare that the gods were displeased. They could withhold the religious ceremonies that confirmed royal authority. They could, in effect, veto pharaonic power through religious means. The priesthood and the throne entered a delicate balance. Neither could destroy the other, without destroying the foundations of Egyptian society. Pharaohs needed priestly confirmation of divine favor. Priests needed royal protection and patronage. The relationship was symbiotic but increasingly strained. Multiple pharaohs attempted to limit priestly power during the New Kingdom. Akhenaten tried the most radical solution, attempting to replace the entire Egyptian religious system with worship of a single solar deity. His revolution failed catastrophically. After his death, the Amun priesthood returned with enhanced power, having demonstrated that even pharaohs could not successfully challenge their authority. The lesson was clear. Direct confrontation with the priesthood was political suicide, but allowing them unchecked power was equally dangerous. Egyptian rulers needed a different strategy, a way to maintain influence within the Amun cult without triggering the kind of religious crisis that had destroyed Akhenaten. Into this tension stepped a remarkable innovation, the position of God's wife of Amun. The title appeared during the Middle Kingdom, but gained political significance. During the 18th dynasty, God's wife of Amun was presented as the earthly consort of the god. She performed rituals that theoretically placated Amun, ensuring his continued favor toward Egypt. She held enormous religious authority, second only to the high priest of Amun himself. And critically, she was always a woman of royal blood. Initially, this position was held by the pharaoh's wives or mothers, women of the royal family who were already connected to the throne. The arrangement worked. It gave the royal family direct involvement in Amun's cult without challenging priestly authority. It demonstrated pharaonic piety. It created a visible link between the divine and the royal. Queen Ahotep held the title during the 17th dynasty. Queen Ahmose Nefertari, who helped expel the Hyksos invaders and establish the New Kingdom, wielded enormous influence through the position. These women were powerful political figures in their own right. The god's wife title enhanced their authority rather than constraining it. But something changed during the Third Intermediate Period, when Egypt fragmented into competing kingdoms. The nature of the position transformed in ways that official records obscure, but administrative documents reveal. A papyrus from year 7 of Pharaoh Shabaka, discovered in Theban temple archives, contains correspondence between royal officials and the high priest. The letter discusses arrangements for the dedication of the pharaoh's daughter. The language is bureaucratic, discussing logistics, housing assignments, staff allocations, revenue transfers, but buried in the administrative detail is a phrase that reveals the power dynamic. In accordance with the terms demanded by the temple as condition for recognition, the priesthood was making demands. Pharaohs were complying, and the terms involved surrendering royal daughters. The Kushite pharaohs, who reunited Egypt from their base in Nubia around 750 BCE, faced a particular problem. They were foreign conquerors who needed to legitimize their rule over traditional Egyptian territories. They needed the Theban priesthood's recognition more than most rulers, because their right to rule was questioned by traditional Egyptian nobility. The priests had leverage. They could grant or withhold religious legitimacy, and they used that leverage to extract an unprecedented concession. The pharaoh's daughter, not his wife or mother, would become God's wife of Amun. She would be dedicated young before marriage. She would take vows of chastity that prevented her from bearing heirs. She would adopt the next God's wife as her successor, maintaining the position's continuity outside normal dynastic succession. Most critically, she would reside permanently in Thebes, within the temple complex, under priestly supervision. This arrangement fundamentally altered the power dynamic. The pharaoh was surrendering his daughter permanently to priestly authority. She would never marry. She would never produce heirs who might strengthen royal power. She would live her entire life inside an institution, controlled by the very priesthood that the throne was trying to manage. The priests presented this as honoring royal devotion. They described it as the highest privilege. They recorded it in inscriptions as evidence of pharaonic piety. But structurally, it was hostage-taking, rendered sacred. And once the precedent was established with the Kushite dynasty, every subsequent ruler faced the same expectation. The first pharaoh's daughter to hold the position under these new terms was Amenertis I, daughter of Kashta. Around 740 BCE, she was dedicated at age 13. According to inscriptions that calculate her years of service, she adopted Shepenwepet, the first daughter of the next pharaoh, as her successor when that girl reached age 12. This established the pattern. Each god's wife would adopt the next pharaoh's daughter, creating a chain of succession that tied each new dynasty to the Theban priesthood. But here is what the inscriptions never explain. Why did adoption become mandatory? Under the previous system, when queens held the title, it passed naturally through royal family lines. The adoption requirement served one specific purpose. It ensured that the god's wife's loyalty belonged to her adoptive predecessor in the priesthood, rather than to her birth family and the throne. The woman who adopted you controlled your inheritance. She determined whether you received the estates and authority associated with the position. She evaluated your performance and could theoretically revoke the adoption if you proved unsuitable. This created a chain of obligation that ran through the priestly institution, rather than through royal lineage. More importantly, it meant that each pharaoh could not reclaim his daughter. Once adopted by the previous god's wife, she legally belonged to that line of succession. The priesthood had found a mechanism to permanently extract royal daughters from family control, while maintaining the appearance of honoring those families. The women who held this position were among the most powerful people in Egypt in administrative terms. They controlled vast estates. They commanded enormous staffs. They performed rituals that theoretically determined the kingdom's fate. Temple inscriptions describe them as beloved of Amun, divine consort, mistress of the two lands, an economic document from year 15 of Asorkan. The third lists properties controlled by the god's wife Shepenwepet II. The holdings included 7 major estates in Upper Egypt, 3 estates in the Delta, 2 trading stations in Nubia, workshops employing over 3,000 craftsmen, agricultural lands worked by 15,000 laborers, and yearly revenue equivalent to approximately 2 tons of gold. This was real power, real wealth, real authority over thousands of lives and enormous resources. But power and autonomy are not synonymous. These women exercised authority, only within frameworks, completely controlled by the priesthood. They performed rituals designed by priests. They lived in quarters maintained by priests. They were surrounded constantly by priestly officials who managed every aspect of their existence. They wielded enormous influence but possessed no actual freedom. And beneath the official inscriptions, beneath the public ceremonies, beneath the recorded honors, lay a hidden reality that no public document would ever explicitly describe. The initiation rituals whose details were kept from even the pharaohs, the isolation techniques that prevented genuine human connection, the physical control mechanisms disguised as purification practices, the exploitation dressed in sacred language, all of it documented only in fragments, in careful readings of what sources omit rather than what they state, in archaeological evidence of spaces whose functions were never officially recorded, in the traumatized bones of women whose mummies reveal what inscriptions conceal. The basin contained water mixed with natron, the salt compound used in mummification. The symbolism was deliberate. Shepenwepet was undergoing ritual death. Her previous identity as Pharaoh's daughter was being dissolved. What emerged from the basin would be something new, something that belonged to the temple rather than to her family. She removed her fine linen as instructed. The priestesses took each garment carefully, folding them with ritualistic precision. These clothes would be stored in a sealed chamber. She would never wear them again. They represented her former life now ending. The water was cold, despite the warm Egyptian night. She stepped into the basin, the liquid rising to her waist. The natron burned where it touched her skin, a chemical irritation that intensified as minutes passed. This was expected. This was part of the purification. The priests began chanting in Old Egyptian, the sacred language used only in religious contexts. Shepenwepet understood fragments, references to death and rebirth, to the dissolution of earthly ties, to emergence as a divine vessel. The language was ancient even to her, carrying weight from centuries of usage in similar contexts. One priest approached the basin carrying a razor of sharpened copper. The priestesses had already removed most of her body hair during the 6 months of preparation, but this final razor was ceremonial. He began with her head, shaving away the last traces of hair while continuing the chant. Hair carried personal identity in Egyptian belief. Removing it symbolized removing attachment to individual self. But the symbolism had practical purposes too. The complete removal of body hair marked her as different from all other women in Egypt. Anyone who saw her would know immediately that she belonged to the temple. She could not disguise herself. She could not blend into normal society. She could not escape without being instantly recognizable. The shaving was marking as much as symbolism. When the shaving was complete, the priestesses poured additional natron solution over her head, letting it run down her face and body. The burning intensified. She closed her eyes. She had been instructed not to cry out, not to show distress. She had been instructed not to cry out, not to show distress. Any sign of resistance would indicate unfitness for divine service. Any sound would mean she lacked the strength required for her sacred duties. Any visible discomfort would suggest she was unworthy. This was the first test. Endure discomfort in silence. Demonstrate capacity for submission to procedures that hurt without providing explanation or comfort. Prove that obedience superseded personal feeling. Show that you could suffer without complaint. She passed. She remained silent, except for the shallow breathing she could not entirely control. The priests noted her compliance. One made a mark on a papyrus scroll recording her successful first trial. After what felt like hours, but was perhaps 30 minutes, they lifted her from the basin. The priestesses dried her with linen and dressed her in new garments. Not the fine, decorative clothing she had worn before. Simple white linen, the kind worn by priests during temple service. Functional, uniform, marking her as belonging to the institution, rather than representing royal status. The garments were identical to those worn by dozens of other temple servants. This was intentional. She was being transformed from a unique princess into an interchangeable component of the religious apparatus. Her individuality was being systematically stripped away, replaced with institutional identity. They led her to an adjoining chamber. This space was larger, its walls covered with paintings depicting the god Amun in various forms. The dominant image showed Amun as a man with an erect phallus, a common representation, emphasizing the god's creative and generative power. Shepenwepet had seen such images before in public temples, where they represented abstract concepts of fertility and creation. But here, in this private chamber, with 4 priests watching her, the images took on a different meaning. This was not abstract theology. This was a preview of what was about to occur. The paintings were an instruction manual, rendered in religious iconography. The high priest of Amun stepped forward. His name was Montuemhat, and he was the most powerful non-royal person in Egypt. He controlled the Theban temple complex with absolute authority. He commanded resources that rivaled the pharaoh's treasury. He had survived 3 different dynasties by making himself indispensable to each successive ruler, through a combination of religious legitimacy and economic power. He was 63 years old and had held his position for over 30 years. He had personally supervised the initiation of 4 previous God's wives. He knew exactly what he was doing. This was not his first time. This was a refined procedure perfected through decades of practice. "You are no longer Shepen-Wepet, daughter of Osorkon," he stated. His voice was formal, ritual, devoid of personal warmth. "You are the God's wife, the divine consort, the earthly vessel through which Amun's will manifests. Your previous identity is dead. What remains is a sacred instrument." He gestured to a platform at the chamber's center. "Lie down, the consecration must be completed." This was the moment when initiation transitioned into something else, something that would never be described in official records, something that occurred in dozens of such ceremonies across the centuries, but was systematically excluded from documentation, something that served no religious purpose, but served many personal and political ones. Shepen-Wepet understood with sick clarity what consecration meant. The 6 months of preparation had included veiled references, explanations delivered in euphemistic language about sacred union and divine marriage and physical manifestation of spiritual reality. But the euphemisms had been deliberately vague, preventing her from fully grasping what they described until this moment, when refusal was impossible. She looked at the door. The priestesses stood before it, blocking any exit. She looked at the priests. Their painted faces revealed nothing. They were not men in this context, or so the religious framework insisted. They were representatives of divine authority. Their actions, whatever those actions might be, occurred within the framework of religious ritual, and therefore transcended normal judgment. But Shepen-Wepet was 14 years old, and she understood that what was about to happen had nothing to do with gods and everything to do with power. She understood that these men had developed a system that let them do whatever they wanted to royal daughters while calling it worship. She understood that she was trapped. "Lie down," Montemhat repeated. "The god awaits his consort." She had been raised to believe that gods were real. That religious ritual connected earthly and divine realms. That priests mediated sacred power. These beliefs had been the foundation of her education, her worldview, her understanding of reality itself. The genius of the system was that it weaponized those beliefs. To resist the priests was to resist the gods. To question the ritual was to question religious truth. To refuse was to commit sacrilege that would delegitimize her father's reign and bring divine wrath upon Egypt. This was the trap. Resist and cause national catastrophe. Submit and endure personal destruction. There was no third option. She lay down on the platform. The stone was cold beneath the thin linen that was already being removed from her body. What followed was violation rendered sacred through context. The priests performed actions that served their own purposes, while describing those actions as religious necessity. They invoked divine authority to justify procedures that had nothing to do with genuine spirituality, and everything to do with establishing absolute control over a 14-year-old girl who had no power to resist and no language to describe what was happening without blaspheming against the foundations of Egyptian religion itself. The ceremony lasted until dawn. Multiple priests participated in rotation. They recorded their actions in documents using coded language. The divine marriage was consummated. The god received his bride. The sacred union was achieved. These phrases would appear in internal temple records. They documented what occurred without actually describing it. Years later, when archaeologists discovered these records, most initially interpreted the language as purely metaphorical, symbolic, descriptions of spiritual communion. It was only through cross-referencing with architectural evidence, with the design of these chambers, with the injuries visible in mummified remains, with comparative analysis of similar systems in other cultures, that the literal reality began to emerge. This was not metaphor. This was documentation of systematic abuse, disguised under religious terminology. When the sun rose, they dressed Shepen-Wepet again. They painted her face with cosmetics in the elaborate style reserved for God's wife. They placed gold, circlets on her wrists, ankles, and throat. They arranged a ceremonial collar of lapis lazuli and carnelian across her shoulders. They positioned a crown of gold and silver on her newly shaved head. They transformed her appearance from victim to goddess. This was crucial. Anyone who saw her now would see regalia and authority. They would not see the damage, would not notice that she could barely walk, would not recognize that she was in shock. The elaborate presentation obscured the trauma underneath. They led her to chambers that would become her permanent residence within the temple complex. The rooms were magnificent. Painted walls depicted scenes of religious triumph. Furniture of ebony and ivory filled the spaces. Linen, curtains embroidered with gold thread separated sleeping areas from reception rooms. Every surface demonstrated wealth and care. She could barely register her surroundings. The physical pain was severe, but the psychological damage was far worse. She had been systematically violated by men invoking religious authority. She had been unable to resist without committing sacrilege. She had been transformed from Pharaoh's daughter into something that belonged entirely to the priesthood. And the most horrifying aspect was that in 6 hours, she would be expected to appear in the main temple for her public dedication ceremony. She would stand before thousands of witnesses. She would accept the title of God's wife formally. She would smile and demonstrate grace, and show the people of Egypt that she was honored to serve. The gap between what had just happened and what she would be required to perform was the space where her identity shattered completely. 6 hours later, Shepenwepet walked into the main courtyard of Karnak Temple. 10,000 people had assembled to witness her formal dedication. Her father, Pharaoh Osorkon, sat on a throne positioned before the temple entrance. The high priest, Montumat, stood beside him. Between them, an empty space awaited Shepenwepet. She moved with careful steps, every movement calculated to hide the physical damage from the night's initiation. Attendants had provided her with medicinal preparations that dulled the pain enough to walk. They had applied additional cosmetics that concealed any visible signs of distress. They had dressed her in garments specifically, designed to support her body while appearing ceremonial. The crowd saw a princess in magnificent regalia. They saw gold and lapis lazuli catching sunlight. They saw a young woman who appeared serene and graceful. They saw exactly what the system wanted them to see. As Shepenwepet walked toward the throne, a voice in the crowd called out, a woman's voice speaking Nubian rather than Egyptian. The words were indistinct, but the tone was questioning. Several Egyptian onlookers turned toward the voice, frowning at the interruption of the sacred ceremony. Guards moved toward the woman who had spoken. She was quickly escorted from the courtyard. Her voice faded as she was taken away. The ceremony continued without further interruption. But in that moment, Shepenwepet had understood something crucial. Her family back in Nubia, her mother's, relatives who had sent her to Egypt as part of the political arrangement, did not know what had happened. They believed the official narrative, and anyone who questioned that narrative would be removed before their questions could spread. The system had built-in mechanisms for suppressing dissent, not through overt violence, but through the swift, quiet removal of anyone who threatened the official story. High Priest Montumat began the formal dedication. He recited prayers that described Shepenwepet's virtues, her devotion, her purity, her perfect suitability for divine service. Each word was carefully chosen to reinforce the narrative that this was honor, rather than captivity. Pharaoh Osorkon spoke next. He declared his pride in his daughter's selection for this sacred role. He praised her willingness to serve the gods. He expressed gratitude to the Amun priesthood for recognizing her worthiness. His voice wavered slightly when he mentioned her mother, who had died 2 years earlier and would never see this day. That waver was the only crack in the performance, but it was enough to tell Shepenwepet that her father was not entirely at peace with this arrangement. Some part of him questioned, some part of him suffered, but not enough to stop it, not enough to risk the political consequences of withdrawal. His doubt was real but impotent. When the speeches concluded, Shepenwepet was required to speak, to address the assembled crowd, to express her joy and devotion, to confirm that she embraced this role willingly. She spoke the words that had been written for her. Her voice was steady. She had practiced this speech for months. She delivered it with the precision of someone who had memorized every syllable and inflection. I am honored beyond measure to serve as God's wife of Amun. This sacred duty is the highest achievement of my life. I dedicate myself wholly to divine service. I renounce all earthly attachments in favor of spiritual communion. I pledge to perform my duties with devotion until death releases me to join the gods in the afterlife. The words echoed across the courtyard. 10,000 people heard her willing acceptance. 10,000 witnesses could later testify that she had embraced this role voluntarily. The system had manufactured consent through public performance. After the ceremony, there was a feast. Shepenwepet sat at the high table between her father and Montuemhat. She was expected to eat, to drink, to converse pleasantly with visiting dignitaries who congratulated her on her elevation. Each bite of food was torture. Each smile was agony. Each polite response required drawing on reserves of strength she did not know she possessed. She performed for 6 hours, while her body screamed, and her mind fragmented under the strain of maintaining composure. Her father spoke to her only once privately, during a moment when attention had shifted to musicians entertaining the guests. He leaned toward her and said quietly, "Your mother would be proud. You honor our family." She looked at him, really looked at him, saw the careful way he avoided her eyes, saw the tension in his jaw, saw the slight tremor in his hand as he lifted his cup. He knew. On some level, he knew this was wrong, but he had made his choice. Political stability over his daughter's welfare. The kingdom over the individual. "Thank you, Father," she replied. The words were hollow. They both knew it. That was the last private conversation she ever had with him. He departed the next day, returning to his palace in Lower Egypt. She remained in Thebes. The separation was permanent by design. If you're still listening, let me know you're here by commenting number 1 below. Like the video and subscribe to the channel to show me your support if you haven't already. Now, let's continue. The chambers assigned to the god's wife were magnificent. They occupied an entire wing of the temple complex, with private courtyards, bathing facilities, and decorated walls that depicted her official status. She had a staff of 50 servants. She possessed estates throughout Egypt that generated enormous revenue. She wore jewelry that exceeded the treasuries of minor kingdoms. But she was alone in ways that wealth could not address. The system had developed sophisticated isolation techniques, perfected over generations. Shepenwepet was surrounded constantly by people, but permitted genuine contact with no one. Her servants were selected by the priesthood through a vetting process that prioritized loyalty to the institution over any possible personal attachment to her. They reported her conversations, her moods, her activities to priestly overseers through a formal system documented in administrative records. A papyrus discovered in temple archives lists the reporting, requirements for God's wife, attendance. Each evening, the senior servants submitted a written account detailing conversations held, emotional state observed, requests made, complaints voiced, visitors received, time spent in various activities, food consumed, prayers completed, and any unusual behaviors. These reports were reviewed by 3 different priestly officials and stored permanently. Shepenwepet discovered this system by accident 3 weeks after her dedication. She found a servant writing in a corner of the courtyard. Curious, she approached and read over the woman's shoulder before the servant noticed her presence. The papyrus contained detailed descriptions of everything Shepenwepet had said and done that day, including a notation that she had wept during evening prayers, suggesting incomplete acceptance of sacred duties. The servant froze when she realized Shepenwepet had seen the report. For a moment, their eyes met. The servant's expression contained something that might have been sympathy, or might have been fear. Then she lowered her gaze and said nothing. Shepenwepet understood. The servants were not her allies. They could not